Hello students, my name is Encia Road from Nord University and I am Associate Professor in Crisis Management. And today I'm going to giving you a short introductory lecture regarding crisis management. So first and foremost, it's important to know what is crisis, and we need to prepare for what, which we are not knowing exactly what is happening and is having lots of ambiguity and uncertainty associated to that one. So when we're talking about crisis, we usually refer to an event or a situation that can threaten the survival of organization, and it calls for urgent response due to survival of organizations and limited damages. Dealing with crisis has been relatively difficult recently. Why? Because we are living in a media-driven society, which every single people can have an access to media and publicize with peoples all around the world. So when we are talking about information flow and the validity of information, this media-driven society puts an obstacle in front of us, so making crisis management even more difficult. On the other hand, lots of technology advancement has helped us to deal with crisis, but still it's lots of complexity coming with that technology. In the literature, there has been two conceptualizations connected to crisis. One is crisis as an event and the other one is crisis as a process. When we're talking about crisis as an event, it's usually a low probability and unanticipated with high impact consequences. And it comes as a surprise. However, we have another one, crisis as a process, which is extended in space and time. And it usually comes with an incubation of problem, which has happened during some period. These two kinds of conceptualization have different properties. For example, properties of crisis as an event is usually only one single event that we are dealing with. It's an accident, it's an incident. And it has been isolated in space and time, and sometimes even in geographical region. But on the other hand, when we are talking about crisis as a process, it develops in a stage of warning and signals. So if the organization or a company or whatever who's dealing with that crisis miss that weak signals, over a time they will feel and face a sudden crisis, which is the emerging crisis. So that's what is called crisis as a process, not a single event. The management of these two types of crisis, like conceptualization, is slightly different. When we are dealing with the crisis as an event, we need to focus on coordination of stakeholders and resources in a very uncertain environment. On the other hand, when we are dealing with the crisis management of process, managing attention to weak signal is very critical. So the management should focus on those kind of weak signal and be alerted to them. All crises have 5 attributes, which is very important to bear in your mind. Number 1 is threats. So all the crises have some threats, which are relative to the problem, and the level of threats can be high or low. And then it's urgency. So the time aspect is very critical. When we're talking about crisis, we are talking about managing a task under time pressure, which calls for urgency. The third one is ambiguity. So crisis situations are difficult to resolve because of the uncertainty and lack of clarity. And then the fourth is stress and emotion. When we are all dealing with crisis, we have to remember it's all individuals and human beings handling that one. Either you are under the crisis or affected by a crisis, or you are managing that one. So threats and ambiguity triggers that stress and emotion. And this emotion could include, for example, fear, trauma, anger, etc. So far we discussed the negative or the heavy side of the crisis, but we have to remember that within all crises we have the opportunity to gain, which is the 5th characteristic or attributes of crisis. In the 5th one, we have to remember always there are some lessons to learn from the crisis, and afterwards you can implement those learning and then try to grow and be better and more resilient for the next crisis. However, what are the causes of crisis? We can refer to three main causes. First could be failure and dysfunction within organization. Second could be external threats from the external environment. And the third one could be the mismanagement of or those who are responsible to handling those incidents. When we are talking about failure and dysfunction within organization, we should imagine the organization as an open system and an organic one, which lots of information comes in and goes. So we have organizational structure, which is shaped based on the competitive advantage they have or what are the goals and mission and what they want to be. And the other one is core technology, like what is the technical competence and approaches they use to produce that service or product. Second one is culture. What kind of organizational culture we are dealing with? Is it the shared values and norm and the accepted behaviors within the employees and organization? Even within same country, within same region, we might have two organizations having absolutely different culture. So this is something different than the culture which usually refers to a nation. Then we have human resource, which is responsible for hiring, firing, rewarding, and this kind of things. And we should not forget about the organizational structure, which is a managing mechanism and the hierarchy structure. You can imagine an organizational chart where you can see how the decisions are made and who has the power and authority. And then we have other components like financial, accounting, inventory, etc. So if there is any failure and dysfunction in any of those, the organization will end up having a crisis. So it's very clear to at least understanding the anatomy of an organization and its key components. The second one, external threats. We should understand that every organization is operating in an environment which has different threats or characteristics. By environment, we are referring to political environment, either this organization or company is operating in a democrat one or authoritarian one. And then we have economic environment, which will explain that if it's an open market, individuals can try and have a startup, or it's very regulated market. Third one is social environment. This one refers to the relationship and culture of individuals and the country and the context of the industry you're working with. Not the least, the legal environment is also important because we have countries like United States which are regulated by common law, but on the other hand we have some countries in Middle East or elsewhere in the world which are based on theology and the religion. So these things are influencing the external environment that might cause some crisis. And the third one, as I mentioned, was mismanagement of the crisis by those who are tasked to resolve that one. If you imagine an incident or a natural disaster and the person who is responsible make a wrong decision, a crisis will not have as much as consequences as that person has made a wrong decision will have. So they kind of escalate the problem, they have escalated the crisis situation. So they will end in a big economical loss or even in the worst case scenario, lives of people. So those who are responsible are very critical decision makers and they can make crisis even worse. Crises are having different dimensions, and if something happens, it will not be limited to only one dimension, while it will have multidimensional effects. And these consequences can have natural environment dimension, technical, economical, human and social, political, legal, and ethical. I will give you an example in this sense. When we are talking about the Twin Tower terror attack, you can imagine after the explosion, the air and the land was polluted. So this shows that environmental or the natural environment consequences. And those people who had offices and computers, all the equipment in the building, they were vanished. So at the second spot, we can see the technical dimensions exist. Of course, stock market dropped down and lots of economical loss was associated to that event. So it shows the economic dimension. Well, around 3,000 people died, lots of injuries and people influenced by that one. So you can see human and social dimension. There were political and reputational things. New York City lost a lot of reputation due to the critique they have received from the collaboration between the emergency and rescue services there. Not the least, some companies claimed a suit against the airline to letting the 5 terrorists being on board, and they had to pay it back. And overall, the whole thing was unethical, right? So no one can agree that. So as you could see in this example, even one incident can have multi-dimension. You can study a simple one as a car accident to a larger scale incident. All of them will have different multi-dimensional effect. And then we should remember that when we are talking about crisis management, we are having different phases to deal with. One is pre-crisis, the second one is crisis phase or response phase, and the last one is post-crisis. The post-crisis usually include the recovery and growing opportunities. So in several countries and organizations, they invest a lot of time and money in the preparedness phase, because by establishing preventive measures, they can limit the cost. And then this kind of preparedness activities could be exercises, could be meetings, could be establishing communication channel. So everything will happen very smooth if something happens. And then we should remember that in the recovery phase and the growth, it's very important to write down or to have a systematic way of recording all the lessons learned from the incidents, because this is the most valuable thing after the crisis. And there is a room for you to grow and then know what is the weak part of your organization. Then you can understand how to deal with them and how to be better next time. Crisis can have different typologies. There are 4 different typologies defined for crisis, based on the speed of crisis termination and the speed of crisis development. You can have fast-burning crisis, we can have long shadow crisis, we have cathartic crisis, and we have slow-burning or creeping crisis. An example for the fast-burning one could be a traffic accident, which happens quickly and ends quickly. And then for a cathartic one could be a psychiatric disorder. A person might suffer for a long period from some issues, psychological problems, but at the end we only see one incident which just end the whole crisis. And then when we're talking about slow burning, we can have a good example like a COVID-19 pandemic. We had no clue when and how it's growing and for how far it will grow and how to kind of control that one. And the long shadow one could be a terror attack example. And then we should know that crisis could be categorized based on the time and the scope. So we have different type of crisis limited to the geographical region. If it's limited to a local region and only a few or one sector is involved, then it's kind of sectoral crisis. Or we have transboundary crisis, which is not limited to geographical region, and it expands to cross the borders and then cross the sectors. And usually all the decisions of levels are involved, and across all nations even, like what happened in the pandemic. And the crisis could be either unintended events or intended events. An example of unintended events could be economical collapse, could be natural disaster. On the other hand, we have intended events, which could be demonstration, sabotage, terror attack. But how we can claim that a crisis could be managed in a good way? There are 4 C's which are very critical to crisis management. One is cognition, second is communication, third is coordination, and the last one is control. But cognition, we are referring to recognizing the degree of emerging risk and recovering ways to act by the information you have, and then identify the location, and at least you can have some information which is valid at hand. And then you can share the situational awareness. Second one, which was communication, refers to updating an emerging network of actors about the crisis and the response operation. This shows the information flow, professional language they are using. For example, in a crisis situation, We have military, which use lots of abbreviation, and they have different terminology than civilian organizations. So it's very important to establish a common language. Third one, it's coordination, which is independent. It shows the interdependency between the organizations. And they need to have established role and set of tasks, standard operational procedures, coordination mechanism, it's a structured or it's a hybrid or it's flexible, how the decisions are made. And the last one is the control one, ensuring that ongoing action remains focused on the shared goal. I will talk about one example that this has been very successful. One of the best practices which we have shared in this project was the landslide in Norway. In 2022, in a municipality, Gjerdrum, there was a landslide happening. It was during the Christmas Eve, and then lots of people were on vacation. We have to remember this is happening during the pandemic. So several emergency actors were actually having a daily communication, and not the least, very informed about each other's responsibility. So it was a very valid and good and robust communication channel already exists. And that helped that this incident be very successfully managed and controlled. So different organizations could communicate in a better way, like police, civil defense, and then fire brigades, road and transportation responsible organizations. So everything worked better. However, in dealing with this landslide, municipality was suffering the most. Why? Because they are not having this type of activities on their daily base activities. They have very democratic decision-making processes. While on the other hand, we have police and other military organizations who are trained to make decisions on a very high pressure and tempo. However, municipalities were not capable to do that. And we have to remember they have never been trained, so they had not even have an exercise to practice how to do. And when the emergency incident and action was end, because in Norway, it's police who is responsible to dealing with the crisis. And when the actual action was ending and then the evacuation was over, the police hand over the crisis to municipality to recover and then just giving the people accommodation. But unfortunately, municipality was not in a position to take that responsibility, so they asked for police to stay longer. But according to the rules and regulation, they were not allowed to do that. So there were lots of tensions there between police and municipality, and at the end there were some civil defense came to assist municipality to develop that one. After that incident, we have learned that all municipalities should train with other rescue organizations to learn about the procedures and the making ad hoc decisions and also improvise in some context. Even though that was successful, it had lots of tensions as well. And we have to remember that happened during pandemic. And then when they evacuated people, they could not easily relocate them in different areas. So they have to be very careful about that. So that was an example and a short introductory presentation regarding crisis management, typology, and then a best practice example. Thank you for listening.